We are now a month into the most incompetent and the most overtly corrupt presidency in history. And I know that sounds like editorial comment, but it is simply fact. It would be impossible for an honest Trump supporter to point to a more incompetent and chaotic first month of any other presidency. And it would be impossible to point to a more overtly corrupt first month of a presidency. Overtly corrupt. The Nixon presidency ended in flames of corruption, but none of that corruption was overt in the first month of the Nixon presidency. President Nixon was not obtaining copyrights for his businesses from foreign governments while changing his foreign policy for that country that granted him a copyright, as Donald Trump has done with China. President Nixon did not have a lease on a federal building in Washington where he ran a hotel business in direct violation of the government's terms of that lease, which forbids an elected official from holding that lease. No president has ever spent his weekends selling access to himself through a private club in Florida that the president owns. No president has ever done anything like those things, and Donald Trump has done all of that overtly, publicly. It may be years before we know all the Nixonian behind-the-scenes corruption that President Trump might have a hand in. But as of now, he is the most overtly corrupt presidency in history, and it's only been a month. The month that feels like a year. How long can this go on? That's what everyone's asking themselves. How long? 4 years? A presidency defined by incompetence and corruption spinning out of control? 4 years of that? We've never seen that before. The lesson of the Nixon presidency is that when the trouble starts and when the corruption starts to go public, the end can come quickly. On this day in 1973, 1 month into the second term of President Nixon, no one in America was using the word impeachment. No one in America was thinking that Richard Nixon wasn't going to get 4 more years. On this very day in 1973, a month into President Nixon's second term, the New York Times front page did not have a single corruption story about President Nixon. Nixon hated the New York Times, but on this day, there was nothing for him to complain about. February 20th, 1973, and there he was on the front page with his labor secretary and the president of the AFL-CIO talking about international trade. And on the editorial page, the Times was editorializing about the International Monetary Fund, the draconian sentencing for drug crime that Governor Rockefeller was advocating, and amnesty for draft evaders and deserters during the Vietnam War, the kind of amnesty the Times pointed out that was supported by Presidents Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, and Lincoln. Scandal in the White House was so far from the minds of anyone at the New York Times that day that they even found space for a short editorial entitled The Romantics, which contains my favorite New York Times sentence ever. In a sense, squirrels are romantics. That editorial was an ambitious, poetic turn about the coming of spring. That's where we were on this very day in the second term of the Nixon presidency, when no one in America knew that in the next year the president would be facing impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives and would resign the presidency 18 months after taking the oath of office, 18 months after a New York Times editorial about how romantic squirrels are. Today, the New York Times has no room for an editorial about the romance of squirrels. Every day, the New York Times reporting is adding to the corruption file of the Trump administration, and they're not the only news organization doing that. All of which makes Mike Pence, the most dangerous man in Donald Trump's life. And at some point, even Donald Trump will realize that. While Donald Trump was at home in Florida today, Mike Pence was in Brussels looking and sounding presidential, in the Republican sense at least. And Mike Pence was asked a question that no other vice president has been asked.
Who should European leaders listen to, you or President Trump?
Imagine how a question like that drives Donald Trump crazy. Who should we listen to? Who is the real president of the United States? Is it Mike Pence? And that question is not going away. What makes Mike Pence the most dangerous man in the world for Donald Trump is that Mike Pence is a standard issue Republican president, a no-drama Republican president, someone who world leaders would be completely comfortable with. They've all dealt with a version of Mike Pence in the presidency before, and Mike Pence would be a president that most Republicans in the House and the Senate would be more comfortable with. He's one of them. What an incompetent, incoherent president needs most is a vice president who scares people even more than the president does, so that no one starts to think getting rid of the president would make anything better. But Donald Trump has Mike Pence, who would be better received around the world and would be better liked and respected by congressional Republicans. And here is something the president does not know about his vice president, something that should make Donald Trump fear Mike Pence more than anyone else in the world. It is uniquely within Mike Pence's power to take the presidency away from Donald Trump. The vice president has the constitutional power to do that, thanks to the wisdom of the 25th Amendment enacted in 1967. The 25th Amendment provided for some situations that the Founding Fathers had not foreseen, like the vacancy of the vice presidency, which tragically occurred in 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated. And then in the age of modern medicine, it became clear by the 1960s that we could have a president who was on some kind of protracted life support, leaving no one with the constitutional authority to act as president. And so Section 4 of the 25th Amendment says the vice president shall become acting president. That's the title, acting president, whenever the vice president and a majority of the cabinet decide that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. People have always assumed that that provision is to be invoked only in health situations, but there is nothing in the language of the amendment that defines what it means to be unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. That is entirely up to the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. They don't need Donald Trump to become medically unable to do the job. They don't need a written opinion from a psychiatrist that Donald Trump is insane. If the president objects to such an action taken by the vice president and the majority of the cabinet, then the amendment provides that, quote, Congress shall decide the issue. And that will be determined by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. And when those votes are counted, Mike Pence could become acting president. That would be that title, acting president. And no one but Mike Pence has the individual power to start that whole process that leads to Mike Pence becoming acting president. Imagine how Donald Trump is going to feel about Mike Pence when he finds out about Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. And I first started talking about the 25th Amendment on Twitter weeks ago. And now the subject has gained a bit of momentum. When I first mentioned the 25th Amendment, no one in Congress was then questioning the mental health of the President of the United States, as at least one senator and a couple of members of Congress have now done with President Trump. We now know that President Nixon's mental stability became fragile toward the end of his presidency as he was facing impeachment hearings. But at this point in the Nixon presidency, no senator would have gone on television, as Al Franken did recently, and wonder aloud about the president's sanity. Psychiatrists and psychologists are increasingly going public, most recently in the New York Times, with their concerns about the president's mental stability. We can expect more and more of them to be going public with those concerns as Donald Trump press conferences continue to exhibit the symptoms that mental health professionals are most concerned about. 1 month. We are 1 month in. At this point in a presidency, it is supposed to be impossible to imagine impeachment. It is supposed to be impossible to imagine a vice president invoking the 25th Amendment and taking over the presidency. But in the age of Trump, the impossible to imagine has become history right before our eyes. It was impossible to imagine the reality TV buffoon becoming the Republican nominee for president. It was impossible to imagine ever having to say the words President Trump. That was once impossible. It may be impossible for Mike Pence to imagine tonight using his constitutional power to invoke the 25th Amendment against his president, but who knows what another month will bring, another 2 months. Who knows what another year will bring? A year of this is now unimaginable. How low can a president's poll numbers go? Donald Trump seems to be on his way to finding out. And as those poll numbers sink every day, Mike Pence becomes more dangerous to Donald Trump because Donald Trump made the mistake of choosing a vice president who is more acceptable to the world and far more acceptable to the congressional leadership of the Republican Party than Donald Trump has ever been or can ever be. How long can this go on? 4 years? Impeachment? The 25th Amendment? In the age of Trump, anything is possible.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.